Issue 62. Amy appreciates the beauty of Angel Island as she drives there in a flying car she suddenly has. So it's impressive that Tails made it like that just in case. I assume it's a reference to All-Stars Racing Transformed, but we were never told that actually happened in canon in the past of IDW, when I know Team Sonic Racing didn't. Somehow she bumps it into a tree and says she should have kept flying, even though she's got eyes in the front of her head. She notices Knuckles isn't in front of the arbitrarily glowing Master Emerald and assumes he's on patrol. The idea that he ever goes on patrol comes out of nowhere. Sonic X had this whole flashback scene of him doing nothing but standing in front of it forever, even in the rain. Why would he ever leave it unguarded like that, especially when it's on top of a tall structure where he could look around and see what's around it for miles? Removing the need to go on patrol. You'd have to go here by plane. He would hear a plane. At least it's new that there's suddenly a lake surrounding Shrine Island instead of nothing but a chasm. But it makes me wonder why that's even possible now. This really is a different canon from the games, because we would have seen this lake in SA1 otherwise. Not a bottomless pit surrounding the bridge. And why is there a green light shining from the Master Emerald without Amy questioning it to make it look like that's never the case? If this was always the case, poor Knuckles for always having to look at something so bright the whole time he's walking up to it. He'd have to shield his eyes. This wasn't the case in the game either, and I'm sure it wasn't the case in the previous issues. So this should mean that someone's using its power to power a machine. But she doesn't think that. She wastes some more panels thinking about how amazing the natural environment looks when I got it the first time. And there's an earthquake. In Archie, this would mean that someone's next to the Master Emerald. The ground opens up beneath her and she falls in a Hydro City. I hope this will be explained. It looks nice, but I'd like it to have a point in the story aside from nostalgia referencing. Out of nowhere, Knuckles glides over to catch her and asks her why she's here. She thanks him as I notice how lucky she was that he happened to be here. Sonic survived this place just fine, so she wasn't in danger. She complains about ground stability, and to my disappointment, he doesn't actually tell her why the ground fell below her. So it looks like her falling in here was forced. I can understand the ground immediately surrounding Master Emerald's shrine being shaky. For people other than Knuckles. She presents him with a rolled up piece of paper, and reveals the Echidna artifacts from underneath it. So why did she wrap that thing around it? Why didn't she just put it in gift wrap paper then? Eventually Knuckles thanks her and she's happy when he asks her to return it to its proper place with him. He explains that he knows where it goes because he's seen that style in Marble Garden. He says to watch her steps so he wouldn't get more holes on the floor. And she lectures him that he should do maintenance on the island, even though she'd know he wouldn't know how, and doesn't have the internet access to learn how. Then in a factory somewhere else, Clutch mentions that he has staff and knows that he's being approached by Mimic because he saw him on security cameras. And how does Clutch have control of a whole conspicuous factory when last time he said the government seized his assets and forced him into hiding in a sewer? I have to assume he's only here secretly because he replaced the actual CEO of the place. But then he'd be reported missing right away and people would be trying to hire a replacement for him. He should have used a new villain. Or at least showed us how he made the transition between being in the sewers and coming here. The only reason these two meeting and interacting makes any sense to me is the meta logic that they both have black corneas, so it's about time they met. But I don't know how they did when they might as well have been in two separate worlds until now. He reveals that he went to great lengths to contact Mimic. So I have to assume that nobody but Tangle and Lanolin know that Mimic betrayed his other freedom fighters and thus can't be trusted as an ally. After all, Whisper really was reluctant to tell Tangle about it and was badgered into it. So there's a reason Clutch is trusting Mimic not to kill him. Didn't Mimic say he doesn't do teams anymore? He says Mimic's not easy to find. Yeah, no kidding. He's a fugitive in hiding and can shapeshift. There better be a good explanation for why he ever found out where he was, because this is impossible. It should have been that Mimic went up to him without being contacted first. This just shows no regard for logic. Him figuring out how to contact him would have made a more interesting story than this scene. Clutch says Clean Sweep Inc. is his way of getting into places others can't to clean up robots and weapons Eggman leaves behind. Mimic compliments his intelligent way to get weapons, and Clutch says the Restoration logically does do everything they do for free, and so they're competition. They also dispose of the dangerous materials, and he says it's a waste of good technology. If it's not that the materials are toxic and radioactive, and he's only calling them dangerous for being weapons, how is the Restoration that stupid as to completely get rid of things that could fight robots and help the military? And why in the hell would someone name something after Perfect Chaos? Something that killed countless people by flooding a city. Not to mention it killed the Knuckles clan. Oh yeah, that's not in poor taste. The only way the person who named it that would have known about Perfect Chaos would also guarantee that he'd find out about the horrible things it did. The artist could have picked a reference that actually made sense. This comic is definitely not going with Sega's Two Worlds idea where Forces is in a separate world from SA1. Because if that was true here, then the average person here wouldn't know about Perfect Chaos because it hasn't been relevant since ancient history. He pours brown stuff into a wine glass. I guess as usual, won't actually confirm that's alcohol, and it not explaining what it actually is makes me wonder why they got away with that. So the scene's meant to build tension by showing the moments where he hires Mimic to infiltrate the Restoration to curb their wasteful efforts. But I'm just completely distracted by confusion over how he called him when Eggman can't because Mimic deleted information on himself in that base of his. He should have wandered here by accident. If he has weapons that Mimic could bring there, weapons could include bombs. So I would expect that Mimic would be told to bring bombs to Freedom HQ. He could hide them in his clothes. He could very easily tell Mimic to disguise himself as an important hero like Sonic to frame him. But if even Clutch knows about Mimic when there was no indication he had ever heard of him at all, that implies that the average person knows about Mimic. Common sense of the Restoration to alert them all to the fact that there's an evil shapeshifter out there. So logically, even if Mimic framed someone, everyone would assume it was him anyways. So that better be what's gonna happen. Or if it's not what's gonna happen, this could at least explain why it's not gonna happen. After he smartly says he's been keeping a low profile and doesn't want to get into trouble, he's told Tangle and Whisper are in the Restoration. Somehow he hadn't already assumed that, even though they're heroes, brave enough to fight robots and stand up to him. And Whisper is a former freedom fighter. So this convinces him. I wish it didn't have that padding scene. Knuckles pushes up a little purple door in the ground with grass on it to escape to Marble Garden. Another thing that reminds me of Archie. Amy notices another earthquake, and he says this whole region is unstable and says ruins are getting buried and unearthed all the time. No, they're not. The only time they got moved around was in Sonic 3. That doesn't explain the earthquakes. Why can't he simply say they're part of the island's security system? The earthquakes were because of Eggman's drilling. Who's burying the ruins? Why is she wasting time telling him Jewel could send people to keep watch over the ruins when it should be obvious to her that he'll refuse to let anyone on his island? He says no, as he'd have to keep an eye on all of them. This is really wasting my time. She teases him about ending the resistance and she gets apologized to for it, and she's about to go into a cave, but he tells her to stop because there's a trap inside and he keeps them working to deter thieves. She runs towards the flying spears, destroying them with her hammer, while Knuckles returns the artifact to its normal place. I'm wondering more than ever why it got removed now. It must have been removed by a flying robot. You'd think the spears would be fired off because a motion detector is getting set off, which would have them activate no matter what was around. Why wasn't the trap already set off? He tells her nice work and gets thanked, and they fall into a hole when the ground opens up below them again for no reason. Why isn't this whole place full of those giant cracks? How did it survive for thousands of years if it does this? He grabs her hand, gliding away. That's really the end of the conflict? That artifact is boring. She advised him to visit Restoration HQ if he ever wants a break for some reason, and somehow he says he'll think about it, because he can't ever keep a lesson learned. Then we see Lanolin state the obvious about her mission with Whisper and Tango. Whisper says her old team just found one another, and they were volunteers. Is this scene gonna have a point to it? I want something to happen. Lanolin plans on improving the team in a smart way and takes Tangle's paddle ball that she should have known better than to use because obviously it annoyed her friends. I assume the guy interrupting their meeting is Mimic. I have to assume the reason he doesn't instantly kill Whisper is that he doesn't want to be chased by the witnesses. I just wish an entire page wasn't spent on him explaining his fake reason for why he's here. I would have enjoyed this if I hadn't seen that Mimic scene. If I had a reason to be invested in this new recruit, maybe I would have cared about what he had to say. I could have seen Mimic just outside of Restoration HQ and then saw him transform into him. He says his name's Duo. It's such an obvious fake name. To be fair, people have dumb creative names in real life too, so that's what they're assuming. But Mimic would have thought of a normal name. Whatever, I'll humor the story and call him Duo until it's inevitably revealed he's Mimic. Just in case the writing was clever enough to make him a red herring. After all, with this color scheme being like Mimic's too, he's way too obvious. Why did Lanolin even bother hitting away the paddle ball? Why does he say before explaining his special skills? He would have already planned on what he was going to say. Of course he says he can use a Wisp-Bomb. Lanolin isn't too impressed, but Tango wants to give him a chance, and so does Whisper, when you'd think she'd be way more overprotective of an average person after what happened to her team. He thanks Lanolin for humoring him, and she tells Tango to get him a place to stay, and he thanks them. He's offered a room with a bed right away, and when she invites him to dinner with her, he turns down a free meal for some reason. And for absolutely no reason, he takes the risk of returning to looking like a Mimic. He also calls someone and says he's in for no reason, which is the kind of risk Metamorphia took, and she got caught right away by Tails because of it. In real life, there's security cameras in basically every building where people work. People work here. So if the logic is there aren't any cameras to catch this because Restoration thought that'd be too paranoid, that doesn't stop people from putting cameras in all sorts of other places. I find it underwhelming that that's the end of the story. It really goes to show you how little happened in this issue. I was hoping there'd be some sort of spooky, magical power to that artifact. Like, I don't know, a ghost was haunting it. Instead it looks like it only existed to give Amy an excuse to visit Knuckles. It was just Hydro City Zone as you expect it, and Marble Garden as you expect it. This confusing, uneventful story was by Ian Flynn, which is why Tango was being an idiot, using a paddle ball at the wrong time. And it had Knuckles return an artifact to a cave, while Mimic gets sent to Restoration HQ by someone who somehow contacted him. The only subplot where stuff was happening was Amy's, and I was always confused by the ground caving in below her constantly, and Knuckles never gets a proper explanation for it. Ruins aren't being buried and unearthed all the time. I know this is a game reference, but it's still dumb. I thought the earthquakes and stuff in Sonic 3 were thanks to Eggman drilling, but that didn't happen here, so it should have been explained as the island's security system. How is this place not nothing but huge cracks in the ground after millennia? Why did Clutch get to be the owner of a new company? Wouldn't people have found out he caged a bunch of chow because it'd be on the news and social media, and so he couldn't have formed a company and gotten any business? Last time we saw him, he was hiding in the sewers because the government seized his assets. I figured if the government didn't do that because of the chow thing, it did it to punish him for not paying taxes. Either way, they'd want him in prison then. I guess the laws are different here. This could have been written as him only secretly being in charge. How did Clutch successfully contact Mimic? He's a shape-shifting fugitive keeping a low profile. There was no indication that he knew about him. He had himself deleted from Eggman's files. He never talked to him before. How would he know his cell phone number? He couldn't call his home phone number in the yellow pages. He wouldn't have access to his home anymore after prison. Someone else would have bought it. Tangle must have told the news media about Mimic after she first dealt with him, or else he'd still think Mimic's a freedom fighter. Mimic could have easily met him because he wandered into this place in his travels wanting to explore it for fun. But the most forced thing is, why did Mimic go here without a bribe when he didn't know what he was going to be hired for, when he said he doesn't do teams anymore? If there was a bribe, you'd think you would have just killed him or threatened him into leading him to the bribe to get it for free. I assume the reason he wasn't told what he wanted to hire him for over the phone, if he could be contacted at all, is that the government records cell phone calls, so Clutch was too paranoid to tell him that. Maybe he was so paranoid that he assumed even an email or text message to him would be read by somebody else. That seems like a stretch. I think Mimic would have already found out that Tangle and Whisper had joined the Restoration from social media, or hearing random people talking. They're escaping a low profile, and there's living under a rock, which he doesn't have to do when he can shapeshift to go anywhere. I wish that scene hadn't been there. It just made me bored and impatient the whole time Mimic was talking in disguise. He could have easily decided to go here on his own because he'd inevitably find out these two worked here, for the same reason Clutch would know about that, even though he hasn't set foot in their base either. So with the same logic for why Mimic was in the dark, he should have been. Because it's not like Whisper and Tangle are the ones collecting weapons and robots on him. This was a confusing, boring issue where almost nothing was happening, with only Amy's part having excitement, and now it's just her going to places we've seen in the games, with nothing happening there that didn't already happen in the games, so it's empty. So it's disappointing when I was hoping for something new, only for the artifact to do nothing. It should have explained that Mimic and Clutch were old high school friends, so they have each other's cell phone numbers.